that a little more in a moment. Careful deliberation, think here of your pro-con lists if you make them. And improvisational or intuitive judgment, think here of following a gut feeling. I want to suggest that none of these approaches to decision making is inherently good or bad, but rather that they each have specific strengths and weaknesses that make them better suited to different kinds of problems. If we want to exercise good judgment, then we need to figure out what kind of judgment a situation calls for. Second, I want to think with you about halachic decision-making in particular, or Jewish legal decision-making. When most of us think about law or legal decision-making, in Judaism, but also in secular law, we tend to have a specific procedure in mind, and this is going to sound familiar from last night. We assume that the rabbi or judge in question looks at a case, identifies the rule that governs that case, and then applies the rule to the case. Although this process, I think, does describe much of legal decision-making, we're left with an impoverished understanding of what Jewish law is and how it operates if we think it describes the entirety of halachic decision-making. Equating law with this kind of rule-based approach can cause us to ignore some of the other innovative ways that the rabbis in the Talmud make decisions, ways that I think can provide useful models for each of us as we approach difficult decisions in our own lives, halachic or otherwise. And then finally, I want to explore one such alternative model, alternative to rules, that we find in rabbinic texts, cases where rabbis act lifnei mishurat hadin. Some of you may remember this phrase. It literally translates to either within the line of the law or before the line of the law. But what it actually means in the Talmud is somewhat opaque. Many scholars have argued that it is used to mark cases where a rabbi ethically goes beyond what the law would require. In contrast to that view, I'll argue today that this term does not communicate specific ethical content. In other words, it doesn't evaluate the consequences of a rabbi's decision and mark it as either good or bad, nor does it tell us what that rabbi's motivation was in choosing to do a certain thing. Instead, I think this phrase communicates something about the process through which that rabbi reached his decision, namely that he relied on his own improvisational or intuitive judgment rather than on an application of legal rules. Importantly, this Talmudic phrase never describes rabbis acting in a formal judicial context as judges, but rather it describes them making decisions in the context of their own lives. As a result, I think these stories have a lot to teach us about what kinds of judgment might be appropriate to different scenarios in our own lives. When should we rely on existing norms and standards? When do we need to deliberate and perhaps change the existing norms and rules? When should intuition guide us? Most of my talk tonight will be devoted to these three questions. We'll look through a few Talmudic stories together and see if we can figure out what might have prompted the rabbi in each story to act the way that he did. Then we'll consider what the story might have to tell us about the benefits and drawbacks of making improvisational judgments, which is sort of going to be my shorthand today for acting lifnei mishurat hadin, and when, if ever, to rely on this type of judgment. But before we turn to those sources, I want to start by thinking about decision making more generally. I'm not going to use as many slides tonight as I used last night. I'm just going to use slides to share the sources when we get to them. So when we get there, I'll share my screen. But for now, I just want to think a bit together. So imagine waking up in the morning with no routine or established preferences to rely on. Every decision you made, mundane or significant, would require both time and mental effort. For example, you would need to consider the full range of clothing in your wardrobe when determining what to wear, and evaluate all of the ingredients available in your pantry as you made your breakfast. Simply getting to work in the morning could become a Herculean feat. Should you take public transportation? Should you walk, drive, bicycle? Which route should you take? And we're just talking about the easy day-to-day stuff, not the kinds of decisions we normally view as fraught or as difficult. Amidst the myriad challenges wrought by the COVID-19 pandemic, the disruption to our daily routines has led many of us to experience a phenomenon known as decision fatigue. This is a term from psychology. Making basic decisions about daily life has become difficult, a difficulty compounded by the lack of clear and consistent guidance from officials and experts. We find ourselves constantly revisiting and reassessing our basic decisions about daily activities, such as whether or how to visit family or friends, go to the grocery store, arranged childcare, and simply making and remaking these basic choices can exhaust our decision-making capabilities. When more significant challenges present themselves, such as a problem at work or a sick family member, those challenges not only seem overwhelming, but many of us have found that our ability to think through them carefully is, in a very real sense, debilitated. So my talk today is not really about COVID-19. We're going to focus on that next Sunday, and we'll look at some of the challenges the pandemic poses in particular. But I wanted to start off with this shared experience of decision fatigue, which I think many of us share, because it calls attention to an important and often overlooked feature of decision making. As humans, we have a limited ability to evaluate and weigh carefully all of the different factors that we encounter in our daily lives. We simply cannot carefully deliberate about everything. So even if we think that careful deliberation is the best way to make decisions, and I'm actually going to argue that it's not always the best way, but even if you think that, it simply isn't possible to always make decisions that way. And our normal routines reflect a subconscious awareness of that fact. To make most of our everyday decisions, we rely on what I will call a narrative script. These scripts use social rules and expectations to narrow our decisions down to a few options that are easier to select among. Are you getting ready for work? Actually, half of your wardrobe, or at least half of my wardrobe, isn't really appropriate. I'm not going to wear my sweatpants, at least in a normal non-Zoom reality. And so it's not really a choice between everything in your closet. It's a choice maybe between your blue blouse or the red one, the black slacks or the gray. Those scripts simplify potentially complex scenarios by clarifying which factors are relevant and narrowing our choices down to a few easy options. I like to think of them as similar to the choose your own adventure novels. If anybody else has read those, I was a big fan of them as a kid. Those novels let you it says if you want to do X, flip to page 10. If you want to do Y, flip to page 12. And they don't tell you exactly what to do or say, but these scripts give you a small range of acceptable actions, each of which will lead to a range of likely responses, which in turn presents you with a range of responses to that response, and so on and so forth. Those scripts, with their predetermined options, reduce decision fatigue, allowing us to focus our decision-making energies on the case scenarios that warrant extended deliberation. Part of why the experience of the current pandemic is so exhausting is that we can no longer return to those scripts in so many situations where we have come to rely upon them. And this has actually come up for me in many aspects of Jewish ritual like this year. It came up during the high holidays, and it's coming up again as we prepare for Pesach. Perhaps, like me, you've been sort of bopping along in your life, celebrating the holidays in roughly the same way for the past several years. Maybe every year on Pesach, you host a Seder meal for your family and friends. You make your Bubby's brisket recipe, and you always sing the same silly song about frogs jumping on Pharaoh while you tell the Exodus story. This was a favorite song of mine as a child, if anyone knows the story about the frogs and Pharaoh. But last year, social distancing meant that it was impossible to invite a large group of people to your home, and you had to adjust. We all figured out alternatives. Maybe you hosted a Zoom Seder instead of an in-person Seder. But if your life looks anything like mine, you probably had a lot of conversations about exactly what to do and exactly how to do it. And it was probably exhausting. And maybe you didn't really like that Zoom Seder as much. Maybe you really missed being with your friends and family. So again, if you're like me, you're probably having those same conversations over again as we approach Pesach this year, trying to figure out what to do. And that sort of happy bopping along, knowing what to expect feeling, that familiar routine that we all rely on so often is gone. We're often unconscious, I think, of how much we rely on these narrative scripts until they stop working. And when that happens, we have a few options. We can try to come up with a new script that will work both for the current situation and for future situations like it. From a legal lens, this often means revising existing rules, and we tend to do that through careful deliberation and reflection. These new judgments may serve us well, since we can keep returning to the new script in the future, but they require time, energy, and careful reasoning, all resources which may be in short supply. And deliberation itself can have some drawbacks. It can be difficult to weigh the importance of various competing factors, and we can talk ourselves both out of and into a decision that's not really right for us. The other option is to make ad hoc or intuitive judgments. That's the improvisation option. It won't give us a new script for the future, but it can help us respond in the moment. Improvisational judgments allow us to be flexible and attentive to the nuances that differentiate one situation from another, but they also tend to rely on intuition. Sometimes our intuitive judgments draw on carefully cultivated knowledge and wisdom. Consider the doctor who senses that something is wrong with her patient, even though all of the tests have come back and shown that her patient is healthy. Based on this gut feeling, she orders more tests, more unusual tests, looking for rarer conditions, and discovers that her patient indeed has a serious but rare condition, saving her patient from potentially fatal consequences. In this case, her intuition has been shaped by medical knowledge and experience. Even if she couldn't fully articulate the factors that led her to think it, she sort of knew, she sensed that something was wrong. This is the great side of intuition. But our intuitions can also be shaped by less benign forces, including deeply held assumptions and prejudices that we might not even be aware of. Consider, for example, the policeman who sees a 12-year-old Black boy playing with a toy gun and assumes he is holding a deadly weapon and responds by shooting and killing him. That's sort of the dark side of intuition. And as I hope these examples illustrate, each of these approaches to decision-making carries unique benefits and drawbacks. Narrative scripts are efficient and effective, but they tend to encode the status quo. When something goes wrong with the status quo, or when the status quo itself is flawed, these scripts have limited utility and can get us stuck in bad patterns. Intuitive judgments can draw out our most deeply embodied wisdom, but also lead us to rely on unconscious prejudices. And it simply is not feasible to deliberate carefully about all of our decisions. Not only that, but some evidence has actually shown that careful deliberation can lead to worse moral outcomes. As the podcast Radiolab noted in an episode on heroism, careful deliberation made people less likely to intervene to save a person in need. After all, there are risks involved in pulling someone out of a burning vehicle or saving them from a goring bull, which were both examples discussed in the episode. And careful deliberation might make us all too aware of the risks that heroic action poses to our own well-being. So instead of seeking the best model of judgment, I think we need better tools to assess the type of judgment or decision-making that each specific situation calls for, and the capabilities or training that might enable a person to make good decisions in those cases. And I want to suggest that Jewish tradition has tools for helping us do just that, but that these tools are often overlooked. So tonight, I want us to recover one of these tools by looking at stories of rabbis acting lifnei mishurat hadin. And I'm just going to type this Hebrew phrase, its transliteration, into the chat, because I know it can be hard to hear words that you're not familiar with over and over again. So that's the phrase I'm saying, lifnei mishurat hadin. That's how I typically transliterate it. Within or before the line of the law. So before we turn to our Talmudic passages for today, let's take a minute to consider some assumptions about rabbinic decision-making, specifically halachic or Jewish legal decision-making. These assumptions shape the way that other scholars have read the stories I'm going to present, and I want to address them so that I can make the case to you that we should read them differently. Given that it only appears in 7 passages in the whole of the Babylonian Talmud and never appears in the Palestinian Talmud, the phrase lifnei mishurat hadin is actually relatively well known. And again, as I said, it means either before or within the line of the law. But there's debate about what the phrase is meant to convey conceptually. In fact, this idea has been at the center of debates about the relationship between Jewish law and Jewish ethics for over 4 decades. The debate breaks down into 2 main camps. One camp thinks the term signals that a rabbi has ethically gone beyond the obligations set by halakha, therefore suggesting that the rabbis of late antiquity recognized a sphere of ethical action that was separate from or distinct from halakha. The second camp thinks that the term is used to indicate that a person has waived a legal right. They argue that although the rabbis in these passages are motivated by ethical concerns, they rely on legal mechanisms to address them, making ethics part of halakha, because the ethical issue is resolved through halachic methods. Much has been made about the difference between these 2 views and how they view the relationship between Jewish ethics and Jewish law. But what I want to highlight today is that actually they share a set of key assumptions, namely that law refers to a system of rules and rule-based decisions, that other considerations, such as ethical concerns, which might impact how one makes a decision, are extra legal, and that the rabbis in these narratives are motivated by ethical and therefore by extra legal concerns. The implication is that taking extra legal factors into account either means you're not making legal decisions anymore, or that you're not making legal decisions properly. Both sides in this debate double down on the idea that legal decision-making is rule-based decision-making, although they disagree about whether that means the rabbis in these stories are making legal decisions. And I disagree with these assumptions because I think the idea of law and legal decision-making is far more capacious and cannot be reduced to a system of rules. As we look at the stories from the Talmud, we'll see that the rabbis who act leafni mishurat hadin take into account various factors other than legal rules. Sometimes they do seem to be motivated by ethical concerns, to be sure, but not always. And I'm going to propose that the main factor that seems to characterize these stories is actually a concern for relationships. It's interpersonal considerations. The rabbis act in relationship to other people, and the contours of those relationships define their decisions. Their actions are still informed and bounded by rabbinic rules. They never break the law, but they're not a simple or straightforward application of those rules. Instead, I propose that these rabbis are improvising, so to speak, within the 4 cubits of halakha, trying to respond to the specifics of the scenario that they face in a more nuanced way than a straightforward application of the law would allow, for better and, as we'll see, for worse. They are still bounded by the law, but they're finding a new space within the line of the law, to draw on the metaphor that's inherent in that phrase itself. They're trying to pursue the things that are important to them in that moment. As a result, they're still playing the halakhic game, but they've switched to a new approach. Because their decisions are contextual and improvisational, they do not establish a new narrative script. They do not set a precedent for future or similar situations. They are decisions that are of and for the moment. So now let's take a moment to look at some of those decisions. And I'm going to share my screen. Hang on one second, so that we can see the sources. All I have on these slides are the sources I'm going to discuss, but I want you to be able to see them as I read from them. So here we go. Hopefully everyone can see that. So we're going to start by looking at the shortest and perhaps the simplest of these narratives from Brachot 45b, which discusses the procedures for reciting Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals. And in that discussion, it raises the example of Rav Papa and his conduct at a family meal. So I'm going to just present the sources today in English, and we'll read them along on the screen as well. All right, so Rava said, "This is a statement of mine, and it has also been stated in the name of Rabbi Zera in accordance with my opinion. In the case of 3 who dine together, 1 interrupts his meal on behalf of 2, but 2 do not interrupt on behalf of 1. No." And again, here we talked about the editors last night, the anonymous voice. This is the editorial voice coming in. No. Is that the case? Didn't Rav Papa interrupt his meal for his son Abamar, both himself and another person? The case of Rav Papa is different because Rav Papa acted leafni mishurat hadin. So now you can see that phrase here, and I'm purposefully not translating this phrase right now. So first, what's going on here? What's being discussed? What's the legal context? They're talking about the grace after meals, which is recited independently unless a quorum of 3 people has been reached. When 3 or more people dine together, then there's this invitation, the zimun, to recite the grace collectively. And so the question arises, what if 3 people eat a meal together, but they don't all finish eating at the same time? What should we do in that case? Do they recite the grace independently or together? And Rava establishes the law as follows. If 3 people dine together, 2 do not interrupt for 1 person, but 1 person interrupts on behalf of 2. So let's say I'm eating with 2 other people and they finish eating before me. I'm supposed to interrupt my meal, say the Birkat Hamazon with them, and then if I want to keep eating, I can sort of functionally start a new meal by myself. But if I finish eating first and they're still continuing their meal, I just say Birkat Hamazon on my own, and everyone will say it independently when they're done. That's the expectation set by Rava's statement. And now the editors, the Stam, that anonymous voice of the Talmud, comes in and say, wait a second, is that really the law? I know that one time Rav Papa and this other guy were eating with Rav Papa's son, and Rav Papa's son finished eating before the other 2. and they interrupted their meal so everyone could say Birkat Hamazon together. And the real question here for the editors is, does Rav Papa have a different legal tradition? Does he think two people have to interrupt on behalf of one person? And is that what's going on in this story? And you can see here, this is sort of an example where Rav Papa doesn't follow the narrative script. Rava's statement establishes an expectation that two will not interrupt on behalf of one. But if we look carefully at Rava's statement, it doesn't prohibit two people from interrupting their meal. They still can do that if they want to. It just creates the expectation that they won't. So when the editors say that Rav Papa acted lifnei mishrat hadin, what they're functionally saying is, no, Rav Papa doesn't have a different legal tradition here where he thinks they were obligated to interrupt their meal. In this case, Rav Papa chose to interrupt his meal along with this other person on behalf of his son. We don't really know why. The text doesn't make it clear, but it's not establishing a new normative standard. The quote unquote normal thing to do is still not to interrupt your meal. We follow Rava's teaching, but you can do what Rav Papa did if you want to. So I think one of the questions that we have once we understand how the editors are framing Rav Papa's actions here, that this is not setting a new legal precedent, is to ask ourselves, well, then why? What is Rav Papa doing? If he didn't think he was obligated to interrupt his meal, why did he? And this is an example of what I would say is an improvisational judgment. In the moment, in this particular case, he wanted to interrupt his meal for some reason. And I'm going to propose that it has something to do with the fact that he's interrupting for his son. That perhaps if he'd been dining with clients or colleagues, he might have acted differently. Maybe he wanted to honor his son in some way by interrupting his meal on his behalf. Maybe he wanted to teach his son about how to properly do Birkat Hamazon, teach him the words. We don't know how old the son is here. Maybe he just wanted to join with him. He had this sort of familial moment where he wanted a minute of togetherness. And he wanted to have this opportunity to say the zimun with his son. So even though we don't know exactly why he does this, it's hard, I think, to say that this is a case of ethical concerns prompting Rav Papa's actions. What really are the ethical stakes in whether or not you recite the zimun with somebody else or not? And I'd be curious if people think there are ethical stakes. I'd love to hear them. So I think it's more a case of etiquette perhaps than ethics, but it is a case of a rabbi's decision being motivated by something other than rules. Okay, so we don't necessarily know exactly what motivated him, but it seems to be this improvisational one-time judgment. It doesn't set a new standard. It doesn't set a new legal precedent. Other people are not expected to behave in the same way, but it's fine to have done so. That's just one example. And in the interest of time, I'm only going to bring two other texts to us. As I said before, there's 7 passages in the Talmud that use this phrase. 5 of them focus on rabbis. 2 actually talk about God acting lifnei mishrat hadin. We saw one last night from Bava Metzia 24b that we're not going to look at again today, but I'm going to bring 2 more sources, one from Bava Kama 99b through 100a, and then a second one from a different place in Bava Metzia. So we can get a sense of the types of contexts in which people act in this way. So let's turn now to the Bava Kama source. In this one, we'll see the context is a bit different. It's a longer source, so I've broken it up into 2 slides. We'll take it in 2 pieces. It was stated regarding the case of a person who showed a dinar to a money changer. A dinar is a type of coin, who declared it to be a good coin, and it was later found to be bad. One baraita states that a professional is exempt, but a non-professional is liable. But another baraita states that both the professional and the non-professional are liable. Okay, let's just pause here. What's going on? Somebody brings a coin to a person whose job it is really sort of a banker, money changer, whose job it is to evaluate coins. And they say, yep, that coin is legit. It's a good coin. But later it's found to be counterfeit. We have 2 Talmudic sources, 2 sources from the first few generations of sages. They're called baraitas because they were not included in the Mishnah, but they are sources attributed to the same generations of sages that are quoted in the Mishnah. And those 2 sources say competing things. One says a professional money changer is exempt from responsibility. He doesn't owe the client anything for making a mistake, but a non-professional is liable. He has to repay his client in some way. And the other one says they're both liable. So again, let's just pause here a little bit longer. That may seem sort of counterintuitive. Why would the professional be exempt, but the amateur be liable? Often we think it would be sort of the other way around. One with more training should have more responsibility. And I think that this next teaching from Rav Papa helps to explain what's going on here. So Rav Papa says, the Baraita which teaches that a professional is exempt refers specifically to experts like Dancho and Isur, who do not require any further instructions. In what case did they err? A new coin stamp was issued. When the first coin with that new stamp came into circulation, they made a mistake and identified the coin as counterfeit. Okay, so Rav Papa is saying, what do we mean when we're talking about professionals here? Really, we mean people who are so expert in their profession. They're so good at this. They never make mistakes that can be attributed to a flaw in their knowledge, mistakes that could be avoidable. The only type of mistake they make are these types of mistakes where there's no way they could avoid them. And the example is the empire issues a new coin, but nobody knows that coin's been issued yet. So how can we blame them for not recognizing it as a valid coin? Nobody knew it was a valid coin yet. That's really a case that's beyond their control. And since that's so beyond their control, we say they're exempt from responsibility. There's nothing they could have done to avoid that. It's sort of this like force majeure example. Whereas if somebody makes a mistake because they just weren't looking very carefully or they weren't very well trained, then we hold them responsible. And functionally, what Rav Papa's teaching does is actually sort of, he reconciles what appears to be a contradiction between these two braitot, these two teachings, by creating what we might say is a three-tiered system. We now have expert professionals who are exempt from liability, regular professionals who are liable, and non-professionals or amateurs who are liable. Okay. And in that framework of the liability of money changers, we now get a story about Rabbi Chia. A woman came and showed a dinar to Rabbi Chia, and he told her it was a good coin. Later, she returned and said to him, I showed it to others, and they said it was a bad coin. No one would take it from me. Rabbi Chia said to Rav, go and exchange this coin for a good one and write it down in my register as a loss. How is this case different from that of Dancho and Isur, who required no further instruction? Wasn't Rabbi Chia also an expert who required no further instruction? We must say that Rabbi Chia acted lifnei mishurat hadin. And then the Talmud quotes a midrash, which is actually found in earlier Tanaitic midrash, which is where the phrase lifnei mishurat hadin first shows up in rabbinic writings. I'm not actually going to spend much time on that midrash today, but I wanted to present you with the full source. Okay, so what's going on here? Rabbi Chia is a professional money changer. A woman comes, shows him a coin, he says it's good, turns out it's counterfeit. He made a mistake. He, we know, doesn't have any liability because he's an expert professional. He does not have to repay her, but he chooses to do so. And here again, and so the editors say, because he was an expert, because he wasn't legally obligated to repay her, but he chose to do so, we have to explain his actions by saying he acted lifnei mishurat hadin. He's not saying that all expert money changers are required to do this. He's not saying that he himself even will always do this, but for some reason in this situation, he opted to. Now, why might he have done that? Again, I think there are several possibilities. Perhaps Rabbi Chia has a longstanding relationship with this particular woman. Maybe she's a longstanding client of his. And he wants to make sure she comes back and continues to do business with him. So he wants to reassure her, look, I'm not even required to repay you, but I will if I make a mistake. You can trust me to do your business. Perhaps the woman is poor and Rabbi Chia is well off. And he realizes that the loss of this coin is going to really be detrimental to her in a way that it's not to him. So he says, I'll take this loss on myself. I'll give her a good coin from my coffers, and I'll write the transaction down as a financial loss to me, even though legally it could have been a financial loss to her. I didn't have to repay her. Perhaps he's just concerned with his business reputation more broadly. He wants to be known around town as a responsible money changer who takes responsibility for his mistakes. We really don't know. It could be that sort of ethical motivation, generosity, concern for the woman. It could be a concern for his reputation, a sort of savvy business move. Any of these, I think, work with the understanding of Lifnei Mishurat Hadin as this type of improvisational judgment that's motivated by specific context and specific relationships. In this case, for some reason, it makes the most sense for Rabbi Chia. It leads to the best outcome in Rabbi Chia's mind for him to repay this woman. And I think this is often a case that's cited as an example of, look, Lifnei Mishurat Hadin, it's this really generous, ethical way of acting. It's often cited because in some ways, it seems like it's a really good reading to say he's just being kind here. He's just being generous to the woman. And it's a great example, I think, of how Lifnei Mishurat Hadin can lead to sort of really admirable actions. This type of improvisational judgment can lead to actions we might really respect. But in our next source, I think we're going to see the ways that it can also lead to problematic outcomes or challenges. So let's turn now to our final source from Bava Metzia 30b. And again, this is a long source, so I've broken it up over several slides. So here is the beginning of our story. And before I begin reading, I just want to sort of situate or set up the situation for you. This is going to be a case where improvisational judgment or acting Lifnei Mishurat Hadin leads to some less than desirable consequences, but we'll also see this passage take a strong stand and argue that this kind of improvisational judgment is actually really important and essential for a flourishing society. So before we look at this passage, I just want to introduce one core category that it's going to use, which has already been discussed in a Talmud leading up to this passage. The idea of what's known as a zakain, the eno lefi kivodo, literally an elder, a zakain, for whom certain actions are deemed to be below their dignity. So there's a certain category of elder, it's not all elders, but a certain category of elder who's due a certain level of honor or respect, and as a result is exempt from certain types of actions that everybody else would be obligated to do. One of those actions is loading and unloading physical burdens. So most people in the Jewish community, in the rabbinic world, if somebody says to you, help me unload this set of packages from my donkey, you're obligated to help them do that. But the zakain is not obligated to do so. And that's going to be really relevant to our passage. Okay, so Rabbi Ishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, was walking on the road when he came upon a man who was carrying bundles of sticks. The man put them down and rested. Then he said to Rabbi Ishmael, help me pick them up. He said to him, how much are they worth? He said to him, half a zuz. That's again a coin. Rabbi Ishmael gave him half a zuz and declared the bundle of sticks ownerless. This is a legal category. You can declare something ownerless or hefker, which means it's legally permissible for anybody else to take it. That's that same kind of ownerlessness that we talked about last night with lost property. The man reclaimed possession of the sticks for himself. Rabbi Ishmael again paid him half a zuz and declared the sticks ownerless. Seeing that the man intended to acquire them for himself again, he said to him, with respect to the rest of the world, these sticks are ownerless, but with respect to you, they are not ownerless. Okay, what's going on here? I think we can read this story from the lens both of Rabbi Ishmael and the lens of the man on the road. Let's think about it from Rabbi Ishmael's perspective. We're going to find out in just a moment in the sugya that Rabbi Ishmael is this special kind of zakain. He is not obligated to help the man with his sticks. But the man asks him for help picking up his sticks, and Rabbi Ishmael, instead of saying, I don't have to help you, he says, let me do something for him. Let me help this guy out. Those look heavy. I'll buy them off of him. But then he doesn't actually want the sticks. And in fact, remember, he's not supposed to carry them himself. It's beneath his dignity to physically handle the sticks. So he buys the sticks, but then he says, all right, I'm just going to declare them ownerless and somebody else can take them. And then the man on the road, rather cheekily, after taking the money from Rabbi Ishmael, says, I'm going to take these sticks back. So he reclaims them. And the sort of process repeats. It becomes a sort of farcical thing where he sort of seems like he again asks for help with them. Rabbi Ishmael pays him again so that he doesn't have to help him. He again tries to say they're ownerless. And then he makes this kind of funny statement. They're ownerless for everybody except for you. You can't take them again. All right. That's Rabbi Ishmael's perspective. The man on the road is probably equally confused and offended by this interaction. He's been lugging these sticks around. They're valuable to him. He comes across this rabbi. He asks for help with them. And instead of physically helping him pick them up, Rabbi Ishmael says, why don't I buy them from you? So the man's probably like, okay, sure, I'm happy to sell them if you give me a fair value, sells them. And then he sees Rabbi Ishmael just discard this bundle that he's probably been laboring over for a while. We can imagine from a man's perspective, that's also sort of upsetting. What's going on here? Why is he treating this as nothing? And the man thinks, well, fine. If you don't want them, I want them. I'll take them back. And then we see this sort of process repeating again. And we can imagine that both parties here are getting very frustrated with each other and don't really understand where the other person is coming from. Okay, so now we'll see the Gemara, the Talmud's analysis of this situation. Because the Talmudic editors, or the Stam, that anonymous voice, immediately picks up on Rabbi Ishmael's statement at the end of this passage. They're ownerless for everybody except for you. And they ask, can an item really be declared ownerless in this manner? As it has been taught, according to the house of Shammai, items declared ownerless can only be acquired by the poor. And according to the house of Hillel, an item only qualifies as ownerless if it can be acquired by rich and poor alike, as in the case of the rules pertaining to the sabbatical year. So Rabbi Ishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, did in fact declare it ownerless, and therefore it was available to anyone to take. It was by words alone that he stopped him. Okay, so I'm just going to pause here before continuing. What's going on here? The editors are saying you can't actually declare something ownerless to everybody except for one guy. There's a debate between the houses of Hillel and Shammai about whether you can declare things ownerless only for some people and not for everybody. Maybe you can do that, saying only a poor person can take this, but they both agree you can't say anyone can take this except for person X. So when Rabbi Ishmael declares the sticks ownerless, the guy actually legally can take them back. And here, Rabbi Ishmael is sort of using his superior knowledge as a rabbi to pull one over on the guy. It was by words alone that he stopped him. Those words actually had no legal force, but the guy on the road doesn't know that. He's not a rabbi. So he's convinced by Rabbi Ishmael's statement, which we might think is not ideal conduct. But then the editors say, but wait a second, wasn't Rabbi Ishmael an elder for whom it was not in accordance with his station to help the man with the sticks? Wasn't he the special category of Zakim? In that case, Rabbi Ishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, acted lifnei mishirat hadin. He didn't have to help the guy at all, but he chose to exercise this type of improvisational judgment. He thought in this case, it was better to try to help him in some way. And here, I think this is where lifnei mishirat hadin really gets interesting. I love this story, and it's in fact probably my favorite of all the stories that feature rabbis acting lifnei mishirat hadin, precisely because of these flaws. The sages of the Talmud were human beings, and they did not always act perfectly. Here we see a man, Rabbi Ishmael, who seems to be motivated by generosity and kindness at the beginning of the story. He could simply tell the man on the road, I'm an elder, I don't have to help you. But instead, he tries to find a way to be of assistance. He had good intentions, but good intentions do not always lead to good outcomes. His plans go awry, and this is an inherent challenge of deciding to go off script, as it were, and improvise. Others will improvise in return. You can't anticipate what they're going to do. And anyone who's ever watched a sketch comedy or improv show knows that can lead in unexpected directions. This act of improvisation reveals Rabbi Ishmael's good heart, but also, I would argue, his prejudices, shown in his willingness to exploit his learning to wield power over someone less knowledgeable than himself, even if just for a moment. It shows the messiness of making these decisions as flawed human beings, and the fact that no matter how hard we try, our best intentions will not always lead to good outcomes. Improvisational judgments allow us to be responsive in a way that rules and scripts never could. They allow Rabbi Ishmael to react in the moment and show compassion to a stranger instead of just brushing him off. But improvisational judgments can also lead us off course into both morally and legally murky territory. They can reveal flaws that may be hidden even to ourselves. But the reason I especially love this story is its coda. After quoting a midrash connecting the idea of lifnei mishirat hadin to a Torah verse, which I'm not going to present for the sake of time, it's functionally the same tradition we saw in Bava Kama, The Talmud brings the following statement by Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, Jerusalem was destroyed only because its inhabitants judged according to Din Torah. And here again, the editors are shocked. Jerusalem was destroyed because its inhabitants judged according to the law of Torah? Should they instead have judged according to some other form of law, like the law of the Magi, the Magian law? Rather, what Rabbi Yochanan means to say here is that they based their judgments on the law of Torah, Din Torah, and they never acted lifnei mishurat hadin. They never made improvisational judgments. There are several statements in the Talmud explaining why Jerusalem was destroyed, each of which highlights something the speaker thinks is especially important or necessary to a flourishing society. And here, after we've just seen all the ways that improvisational judgments can go awry, we see Rabbi Yochanan arguing that society cannot flourish unless people are sometimes willing to abandon rule-based decision-making, or Din Torah, the law of Torah, and make these kinds of ad hoc and case-specific decisions. These decisions allow for a degree of compassion and generosity that a straightforward application of the law would not allow for. They enable people to acknowledge relationships that shape their social world and give meaning to their lives. And they also allow people to make mistakes without those mistakes setting a new precedent or establishing a new script. In other words, without ensuring that those mistakes will be repeated. Of course, it's possible that good improvisations might be repeated and eventually codified, but I think this end of the story highlights the importance of being able to experiment with responsiveness, to remain attentive to the particular details and contexts that confront us, and to try things out, to realize when we've done well and when we have erred, and to try and refine our judgments and decisions moving forward. When Rabbi Yochanan says that Jerusalem was destroyed because its inhabitants always judged Din Torah, he's not saying they should have based their judgments on something other than Torah, some other system of rules like Zoroastrian law. He's saying that improvisational judgments are a part of law, an essential part of law broadly conceived, and they're necessary to a flourishing society. So, what do these stories tell us about decision-making in our own lives? I want to pull out 4 features that I think might offer helpful guidance, and I'm going to end the slides here. First, these rabbis try to act within the boundaries of the law. This is not a license to break halakha or secular law by analogy, but rather an acknowledgement that general rules may not speak sufficiently to your particular circumstance. And in that case, improvisation is an option. Second, these rabbis act lifnei mishurat hadin within the context of their daily lives, and they never act as judges in formal cases. They never make these decisions in a formal courtroom context. This suggests that different types of decision-making are important to different contexts and appropriate to different contexts. Rule-based decision-making and careful deliberation are called for in the courtroom, and they may require special types of training. Improvisational judgment may be called for, at least sometimes, in the course of daily life. And it's worth thinking about what kinds of training or awareness we might need to make these judgments. Third, these rabbis are influenced directly by factors that are unique to them and their relationships with the people they engage with. Allowing such factors to influence your decisions is not necessarily a bad thing. Acknowledging context can lead to compassion, and subjectivity can bring important insights. Searching for the objectively right course of action can be misleading, because what is right for me may not be right for you, and what is right for me in one context may not be right in another. Finally, to make a decision is to open yourself up to error. There is no way to avoid this. And as we see in these stories, even very wise and learned people can make mistakes or disagree about the proper course of action. So in closing, I'll just note that as a perfectionist myself, I know that it is tempting to respond to this last point and say, I'll just never make an improvisational judgment. I'll just stick to the script and then I can't make a mistake. But I think the key point that Bava Mitzvah 30b is trying to teach us is that that inclination too is an error. The script can be wrong. As we know from our own history, the status quo can encode serious moral and legal problems. A refusal to go off script can cause us to show a lack of compassion towards ourselves and towards others, ultimately eroding our society. To paraphrase Rabbi Yochanan, Jerusalem was not destroyed because people were not strict about keeping Torah law. It was destroyed because they were unable to make contextual or unwilling to make contextual improvisational judgments. And they eroded relationships of compassion, care, and responsiveness in their society as a result. We have to be willing sometimes to make these mistakes. The Talmud, I think, suggests that this is not only allowed, but required. Okay, so that is the end of my sort of formal remarks. And I would love to hear what you all think about this proposal, this model of decision making, if it makes sense of what we see in the sources, how we might think about applying it in our own lives.
I have two questions from the comment box. The one question is really two parts. And the questioner is asking you to reflect on the relationship between the rabbi and the man with the sticks. And one part of the question is, would it have been obvious that the rabbi was a person who could not help? And then the second part of that is, what really did Rabbi Ishmael expect the person to do there? He could have explained the situation and offered alternatives, but he didn't.
Excellent. Okay, wonderful. It's a great question. So a couple pieces to that question. First, this category of the elder can literally mean an older person who would be visibly elderly, or we would see, okay, they're a person advanced in years. But the elder can also be someone who's especially respected, wise leader of the community who might not be advanced in years. That term, the zakin be'eno lefi kavodo, is applied to people who are not necessarily elderly, but are seen as elders in the sense of wise leaders in their community. So it's not necessarily immediately apparent to the man just by looking at him that he's an elder. Also, we don't know very much about this man. He may not be familiar with rabbinic law at all. So he might not know. Many Jews were not particularly familiar with the details of rabbinic law in this time period. So he may not know that this special category of elder is exempt from assisting, even if he could tell that he was an older person. So it's a great question, but I think that's probably why he asks him for help in the first place, doesn't realize that he would sort of naturally be exempt. Either he's not elderly or the man is unfamiliar with these teachings. But I think it's a great question. What is Rabbi Ishmael thinking? And why doesn't he just say something like, I'd really like to help you out, but I'm an elder and I am not required to, or perhaps on a reading of rabbinic law, not allowed to engage to physically help you, because doing so would somehow not just be below my dignity, but would somehow demean me as a representative of Torah and therefore sort of diminish the honor that's due to Torah. So I can't help you physically with a stick, but I'd like to help you out. Why don't I buy them off you? We can't know why he doesn't say that, but I think it's a great question, how he doesn't anticipate what the man's going to do when he declares them ownerless. It sort of feels like if he just paused for a second and thought through that and tried to put himself in the other guy's place, he might have anticipated that this is going to be confusing or distressing to the other man. And I think that's one of the things, it's part of why I think the story is so compelling, because we see Rabbi Ishmael's good intentions, and we also see a certain degree of flexibility. Hey, I'm going to improvise here. I'm not just going to say, can't help you out. I'm going to do something else. And then we also see an inability in the moment to think that extra step further, not only to anticipate the other person's reaction, but also once he knows how the other person is going to react, it's a bit bizarre. And again, for me, this story is actually quite amusing. It's almost farce-like that he then says, let me just try the exact same approach a second time, and let's assume we're going to get a different result. He seems to stop his sort of flexible thinking at some point and decides to just double down on this way of doing things, even though it didn't work for him that well in the first place. And again, I think that that's part of sort of the didactic or teaching nature of the story. We are not perfect individuals, and the rabbis, as much as we may revere them as wise as they were, still are not perfect decision makers. They're not omniscient. They don't know everything. They can't, even in their best attempts, always anticipate how somebody else will react. And I actually think for me, this feels very real to me as an interaction. This is the type of thing that happens in my life. I do something thinking it will be received a certain way, and the other person receives it very differently than I intended, and I'm taken aback. And then I later say, gosh, I should have known they were going to think that. If I just thought it through, I could see how it would come across that way. And perhaps I'm particularly insensitive as an individual, but I expect other people have that experience as well, because we're limited as people. We can't always anticipate how others will react to us. And I actually think that's part of what makes this story really compelling to me, is it seems like a very real, plausible interaction.
I'm going to try to meld two questions that are in the box right now.
Sure.
One is, how do you decide when to act purely in accord with Din Torah, and when do you decide to apply either situational or improvisational ethics? And then at the same time, are these instances that you've talked about unique, or are there other similar circumstances where a rabbinic court was called?
Interesting. Okay, great. So I would say the first question, or first part of the question in my mind, is the $1 million question. How do you know which one to do? That is at the heart of making wise decisions. How do you know if you should just follow the rules as they're written? And how do you know when you should deviate from them? And the answer is, there's not one principle or rule, one size fits all answer to that question, at least not one that I've come up with, despite spending many, many years thinking about this. But I think the beginning of an answer is, all of these seem to be contexts. All of these stories seem to highlight cases where a person feels that just following the norm, following the rule as written and applying it sort of rigidly would not achieve a desirable outcome. Or perhaps, like we talked about last night, if you remember that story about the lost purse and Mar Shmuel saying, act lifnei mishurat hadin, or the editor saying Mar Shmuel says you should act lifnei mishurat hadin, perhaps feeling like there's some kind of disconnect where the rule didn't anticipate this context, and applying the rule wouldn't achieve its goals. So there's some moment on the part of the decision maker that says, I know that I'm allowed to do X, I'm expected to do X. X is the normal thing to do in this situation, but it doesn't fit right with me. It doesn't feel like it will lead to a good outcome. It doesn't feel like the best course of action. And I think there's something else I can do that's perfectly permissible within halakha that would lead to a better outcome. That seems to be the prompt to act lifnei mishurat hadin. And that's part of why I say it seems to be motivated by interpersonal relationships, because there seems to be, even though in the case of Rabbi Ishmael and the man on the road, they have no prior relationship, there seems to be some sort of sense of, I'm in this relationship with this person. I want to help them. I want to achieve a good outcome for them in some way. I think there's often that sort of interpersonal social kind of prompting that says, it doesn't feel quite right to just say, dude, I'm an elder, I don't need to help you. Or, hey, technically it's my purse, I don't need to give it back to you. It just doesn't feel like that's the best option. But again, that's not a clear principle or rule for how to know. It's really up to the decision maker. And I think that's part of what makes this so hard. And that's why wisdom is the goal of a lifetime to attain, really. It's not to be able to be a good decision maker in that way. I think it takes a really long time to figure out how to hear those intuitions and judge them well. And now I've forgotten the second part of are there courtroom contexts that are analogous? Are there sort of cases that come to court that are similar? And that's a great question, to which I don't really have, my answer is that I can't think of a exact parallel to any of these particular cases, any of the three stories that we looked at today, although there are certainly court cases or sort of official judicial contexts that deal with disputes over ownership. There are official judicial contexts that deal even with, ritual law doesn't tend to be called up in court. So something like Birkat Hamazon wouldn't. So I would say there's no neat parallels, but we might find some sort of general similar cases if you wanted to compare them.
Lori Hollander wanted to ask a question directly.
Yeah.
So unmute.
Thank you. I was curious, this isn't so much a question about the law, it's a question about those rabbis that we revere. I know he must have had sensitivity and compassion for the poor. He showed that.
Mm-hmm.
So it strikes me that he had no clue that the man would be humiliated by his way of treating him. And
Mm-hmm.
also, this sense of the respect and dignity of an elder, of a rabbi, being something that you wouldn't stoop to do things beneath your dignity, and it would be beneath your dignity to help someone with their physical burden.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that's come up for me because I've seen people who didn't want to stoop to certain physical functions of caregiving that they felt were beneath their dignity with their loved ones. And my feeling about it is completely the opposite, that nothing is beneath your dignity to do for someone who
Mm-hmm.
gave you life. So it strikes me like, why could, even if the rabbi felt so strongly, I mean, first of all, he was an old man, so he could
Mm-hmm.
have just said, hey, I'm physically unable to help you. I wish I could. Could I just give you some money? And that way I
Mm-hmm.
can make you whole without injuring myself. He didn't have to stand on dignity. But
Mm-hmm.
even if he was so steeped in this tradition that he thought it was really about dignity, did he really not have any clue how humiliating that would feel to the other person? Because I get what you're saying. This happens to me too, that we're always blind to something, and that people take in something we're trying to do to make them whole or to benefit them, and they take it in a different way. I get that. But this seems so extreme. It's funny. It's almost like a didactic lesson in how blind even a revered sage could be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I mean, all I can say is when we read the text, I find it hard to, it does not seem like his goal is to humiliate the other man here. It seems pretty clear to me that he's trying to help him out. He's trying to be kind. So he does seem to have this blind spot, as you put it, about this. And maybe often one thing that often happens with Talmudic stories, they often, we should not read these stories as like a mini movie reel documentary of what actually happened. They are often highly crafted stories that have been highly edited. And we can see evidence of that by comparing manuscripts or comparing versions in the Palestinian, the Babylonian Talmud. But I say this even without showing you the evidence. There's a lot of scholarship on this, that they are highly crafted and edited stories. So it may well be a didactic story in the sense that you're talking about, that the editors frame it, or whoever presented this story in this way framed it to highlight that even Rabbi Ishmael, this great, brilliant, compassionate sage, was blind to this. And so we should all be aware that if we're going to make these types of judgments, we may have blind spots too. And yet, I think it's so revealing that the editors chose to juxtapose that story with this teaching of Rabbi Yochanan, which they interpret and reframe as being about just how essential it is to sometimes act in that way. So that's definitely an editorial move to put those two teachings, that story and that teaching together, to say, look, we know this can go wrong. And here's an example of someone who you probably think is way wiser than you, doing it not perfectly. And on the other hand, to fail, to be unwilling to ever make these types of judgments would really be a failure for our culture. And to say that that's why Jerusalem was destroyed, that people were unwilling to ever make those kinds of judgments, that's very hyperbolic. That's the way that people say this is the ultimate sin of society. That's not actually, Rabbi Yochanan doesn't say that. The editors reframe what he's saying to make that point. But still, I think it's revealing of how they understand this type of making judgments.
Do improvisations ever become precedent?
Excellent. Great question. So yes, they can. And actually, this category of Lifnei Mishurat Hadin has a really interesting post-Talmudic history. So in the Talmud itself, it seems very clear to me that this phrase itself is really deployed by the editors to explain rabbinic actions, and that they use it to signal to the reader, this is not a precedent-setting action. They use it to describe actions that seem to go against existing laws in some way, or deviate from expectations in some way, and say, this is possible, this is illegal, this is acceptable, but it's not precedent-setting. However, this phrase has a long history in post-Talmudic thought. Comes up a lot in the thinking, or not a lot, but it comes up in the thinking of different medieval authors. Maimonides writes about it, Nachmanides writes about it. And we actually see in the phrase coming up, funnily, in courts of law, in a Beit Din, a Jewish court of law, where we see that some Ashkenazi courts, so it's different in the Ashkenazi world and the Sephardi world, but some Ashkenazi courts made lifnei mishrat hadin what's known as actionable. So you could compel someone to act lifnei mishrat hadin in a situation. The court could say to you, technically the law says X, but we're gonna make you act lifnei mishrat hadin and do Y. So it has a really interesting history. That's not the primary way it comes to be understood, but it is possible, it seems, for it to become sort of that kind of precedent-setting action. Or at least it was possible in the minds of some legal thinkers at some point in Jewish history.
I'd like to ask if any of the people who've posed a question want to ask a follow-up, if they could just pop their, either let me know in the chat or wave their hand on, use the hand raise function in their box. Suzanne?
Hi, good evening. Yeah, I wanted to follow up on what you were just saying, to understand that law can have sort of floor and ceiling to them, and there's a sphere of acceptable action within that. So I'm thinking of the story about the tree of knowledge, Adam and Eve, and I think part of it goes that the snake pushes Eve to touch the tree, nothing happens. She had been told, don't even touch it, because it was creating a stricter fence around the law, so to speak. Nothing happened. And so by creating more chumras, more strictures than are necessary, you can run into problems. I'm just wondering if that enters into, you mentioned that in some cases in the medieval courts, et cetera, they would say, well, we will actually compel you to do something beyond those either minimum, well, I'm assuming the floor of action. I mean, is there ever the concern about not going too much beyond,
not just sticking with the floor all the time kind of thing? Yes, I think that there is. And so there's actually a really interesting Talmudic story that's cited all the time. It's cited in all the commentaries as an example of lifnei mishrat hadin, even though the phrase itself does not appear in the Talmud. But it's a story about a rabbi who hires some porters to carry barrels of wine for him. And they break the barrels, and he is mad at them. And he refuses to pay them for their labor, and he also takes their clothes as sort of a, like, I'm going to hold this until you can, make the economic loss up to me. Both of those actions seem to be technically permissible, legally permissible for him to do. But the porters take their case to another rabbi. They kind of bring him to court and say, we want our clothing back, we want our wages back, or we want what we're owed. And twice, in both the case of return, the rabbi says he is required, Rabbi Bar Chana is the owner of the wine. He's told he has to return their clothing to them, and he has to pay them their wages. And both times he says, is this the law? And both times he is cited a verse that says, I'm now forgetting the exact verse, so I don't have the text in front of me, but it basically says something like, you should do what is good. And so, but the rabbinic judge says, yes, it is the law, and then cites this verse saying you should do what is good functionally. And I think that actually is a story, and I think that really gets at your question of sort of floor and ceiling, that there's this idea that we see in Jewish tradition that it's possible to be what's called a scoundrel with a Torah license, that you can technically do these things that we agree are not actually, right? So Rabbi Bar Chana could have been a scoundrel with a Torah license. He could have said, technically, I'm allowed to take your clothes and not pay you. And the other rabbi is saying, that's not really following Torah. Torah is telling you to be a good person. And look at these poor guys. They're shivering in the cold and they have no money, and you're wealthy. You need to help them out. And so I think it's not coincidental that all of the commentators think that this is an example of being told by an official rabbinic judge to act lifnei mishurat hadin, even though that's not the phrase, that phrase does not show up in the Talmud itself, because that is the way it sort of comes to be understood, that it's one of a group of different principles that get cited at different points that basically say, it's not sufficient to follow all of the laws. You also need, just in terms of their detail, you need to be a good person. You should walk in the paths of peace. You should be pious. You should act lifnei mishurat hadin. You should do, there's a bunch of phrases that come up here that seem to be related to that idea that you're talking about. It's not sufficient to stay at the floor. We need to push up towards some other kind of aspirational way of being. And I think that that is part of what's going on in the editor's interpretation of Rabbi Yochanan's statement, that Jerusalem was destroyed because people followed Din Torah, because people followed the law of Torah. That can't be a problem. But maybe it was destroyed because they were doing this kind of scoundrel with a Torah license thing. They were literally technically following the law, but they weren't following broader teachings which are understood to be part of Torah, that say you should be a good person, you should walk in the paths of peace, you should care for the poor, you should do all of these things. And that acting lifnei mishurat hadin seems to be connected to that kind of pushing above just the technical law into what's actually the best course of action here, what's a good outcome for all involved.
I think Erwin Weiss had a follow-up question.
I wanted to ask you this. All of the examples that you've given, so far as I can tell, would fall into sort of the category of bein adam lechavero, between man and his fellow person, or woman and her sister or person. So, and the question is, can you think of any example that falls into the other category of bein adam lemakom, between a person and God?
That's a great question. And the short answer is no, that I haven't seen any classical sources that frame lifnei mishurat hadin around that. Although it is interesting that we do have two sources that we might say actually address bein hamakom la'adam. So there's two sources, that's not a phrase we use typically, but there's two sources that talk about God acting lifnei mishurat hadin. And those sources are very clearly about God being more compassionate in God's judgment of humanity than God is technically required to be. So they're both stories about how God would be well within God's rights to punish people, to be angry with people. People have failed, people are not living up to God's expectations, they're not doing what they're supposed to do. But God wants to be compassionate towards God's children, is often how that's phrased. So it's invoking this kind of parental relationship between God and people. And those stories actually seem to be from an earlier strata, potentially, of the Talmud. So it seems like this model, this idea of lifnei mishurat hadin, may originally be used to talk about divine compassion, and then adapted to thinking about, if God can treat people this way, what would it look like for people to treat people this way? But we don't really see an example of people then reacting to God this way, or at least not one that I'm familiar with. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have a question now?
All right. Well, if I'm getting the sense that we've asked all of the questions. What I do just want to say is I know that yesterday and today we stayed, if you were here yesterday, I stayed in this realm. We're really stuck with rabbinic sources. We thought through a lot of concepts. We stayed in a somewhat general realm of thinking about how do we think about ethics? How do we think about making decisions? If you're itching for the particulars, you're like, okay, give me a concrete case today and tell me how we should think about what to do about it using Jewish tradition. I'm not going to tell you what we should do about it, but I do really invite you to come next week where we're going to look at what some different Jewish thinkers have said about really concrete cases, very specific cases today related to the COVID-19 pandemic and how they're reading classical sources to think through those ethical questions. So if you're waiting for the rubber to hit the road, so to speak, in that sense of like, get me to the concrete practical application, I love the conceptual stuff, but I really encourage you to come back on Sunday and see not specifically how Lifnim Mishrat Hadin plays out with that, but just see some examples of what does it actually look like to use these classical sources to think about a very contemporary question that may not have clear precedent.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was an excellent program. So thank you so very much. And we will have our third lecture next Sunday at 5, same channel, this time, same time. And so thank you, Professor Deborah.
Thank you.
A lot to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful to learn with you all. Have a great night.
Have a good night. Thank you.